All right, let's open up for questions. This is for individual speakers or for the panel as a whole.
I have a question for Derek. Could I start? No? Anybody else? So maybe I missed it, but and you probably know what my question's going to be. But so, what are examples of neutral?
That's a great question. There's some that are, landscape, just a territory, not like pretty landscape, but just land. I think there's something about how to dial a phone number. I mean, you can find a lot. We basically have arrays that just grab things on YouTube and then we norm them. So I won't say things that are boring, but things that just don't have any, like there's a canvas map in one of them, interactive, just to write in one of the documents. Lines that move around. People do choose them though, not infrequently.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I know that you're doing ratings, but I mean, I think it's a very difficult thing. Do you ask your participants to rate after the fact on whether it was?
They rate their mood.
I know, but do they rate the videos?
No.
Okay.
I have a question for James Jackson, but I believe that maybe Dale Griffin and also Richard Lucas may have some insight on this as well. And I'm pretty curious about the way that you operationalized life satisfaction. It seemed a bit unconventional to me to specifically have participants contrast their current life satisfaction with their previous life satisfaction. And I know that Tversky and Griffin did some work on this back in the 90s, and I don't doubt the role of contrast when making an evaluation of life satisfaction. But I wonder if those data may have looked different if you would have used a more conventional satisfaction with life scale that didn't prime them to make that contrast with a previous event.
I'm not exactly sure on the answer to that. We use the usual Institute for Social Research measure of life satisfaction, which is, in general, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days. The contrast was with what they had to say, because it was a longitudinal sample, what they had to say at time 1 versus what they had to say at time 2.
So was that dummy coded?
Yeah, I dummy coded the whole thing.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's the reason why, and I mentioned this to Shinobu before, there are other ways in which we could have coded this and probably need to do so. We actually lost a lot of data in terms of doing it in a particular way that we did do it. And, as we proceed with regard to this research, we'll try to do it a different way. But we asked them about their life satisfaction in what year, 79, and then we asked them about their life satisfaction in 1992 and 93. And then we took the contrast between those two, because they were
A residual
individual
change.
data.
It was a residual change score.
It was a residual change score that was economized into decrease,
Right.
stayed the same, or
Yeah.
increase.
So it's not the.
I see. That answers my entire question.
Yeah, because we wouldn't have done
Misunderstanding
that.
of my
That would have been kind of interesting. There would have been no reason to do that.
I have two questions.
Well, there may have been a reason to do it.
One for James, just sort of following up on that, is it possible that the meaning that I'm using for in my world, the factor structure of the life satisfaction measure, even though it's one item, I'm doing some evaluation with a bunch of different opinions, is different for groups in the different quartiles or different methods. So, with one item or two items, it's hard to look at that, but that might be some possibility.
Well, actually, you don't know, no reason why you should. We've actually done a lot of work on that. And we know, for example, that the meaning of health satisfaction, let me use one which I'm very sure about, really is not the same across blacks and whites. In fact, if you look at, we've done some modeling on that particular item. We've also done some work where we actually directly ask people about the meaning. We've done something oftentimes used in cross-cultural research where we follow up closed-ended items. And one that we've been particularly interested in is health satisfaction. And we ask people following their particular response on the closed-ended item, exactly what did that mean to you? And I can tell you right now that there are vast differences between the ways in which blacks answer that question and the ways in which not as many whites answer that question. So the actual content of the question probably differs in ways culturally that probably need to be looked at. So the answer to that is right. Yes.
And then for Dave, if you study people who are professional decision makers or professional game players who aren't interested in the norms of the system, might they do something different?
It's an interesting empirical question. I mean, there is some work out there about donation and self-sacrificing behavior. And the common finding is that economics majors do it less than, let's say, psychology majors, because they're following potentially different norms in their different societies, or many societies. And about half of that is explained by selection, who selects themselves into those majors. So I can imagine if you move, depending on what behavior you're looking at, if you move from society to society, yes, you'll get different norms. But the other thing that's interesting as well is that if you move from situation to situation, or just perturb a little bit of the features that are inherent in the situation, things change. So for example, in this economic game called the trust game that I presented today, if you instead shove that into the format of a prisoner's dilemma game, and I won't go into the details of the prisoner's dilemma game, but the economic outcomes are exactly the same. You get very different behavior. That's because the features of the situation themselves cause people to infer different norms are in play. And we're trying to figure out, that's terrific for experimentalists to try to figure out what are the features that people are reacting to, but unfortunately often there are many candidate features. Thus the work will take 12 years, for example. But so I think the answer is yes, but both in terms of populations or societies and also in terms of specific scenarios that you're presenting to people.
So my question also relates to this idea of norms. A lot of the talks this morning throughout this weekend have focused on the potential benefits of experiencing mixed emotions or balanced emotions. But this idea really, I think, is counter to a really strong intuition of what we want to do is feel positive emotions and not feel negative emotions. So I'm wondering if you have experienced this as a challenge in communicating your potential field, or if you have any advice to leaders on yourself on how to effectively communicate your feelings. Jacky, first round.
Okay, so, well, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, on the most part, yes. With the psychological system, our mind is geared to remain fairly, in a positive state, in a sense. And we have, I mean, there's a wonderful paper back in 1990 or so from Shelley Taylor, reviewing all the different strategies and coping mechanisms that we use to minimize negative emotions. Negative emotions hurt physically, right? And so we have a lot in our battery. We don't have very many to uplift ourselves. But on the other side, I think that part of the issue is that we, all of us put ourselves into challenging situations deliberately, right? Like writing grant proposals, even though you want to do other things. Or, going through grad school for 5 years because you have this longer-term goal. right? Or putting up with people because you really want to get to know them, or something like that, right? So we put ourselves into situations which are almost the probability of having some frustration, irritation, whatever, is going to be high, right? And so, but we do that from a relatively positive state, so we still see the benefits in it, even though there are going to be some costs. And the idea is to sort of get some balance between these benefits and costs, I guess, but I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at.
We can't possibly mean that, the best thing all the time in all the world
No.
is that people feel positive emotions.
Exactly.
I don't think we even want to put ourselves in that particular position.
No.
In fact, the notion of studying mixed emotions is really trying to get some understanding about how those mixtures may indeed work. I mean, you need to be Pollyannish in how you live in what particular sort of way, seems to me to be not that interesting. Clearly, negative emotional states can be motivating.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there's any question about it. How that operates in what particular sort of way has to be there. But I think you're right. I've heard some bias, in our conversations that would be leaned toward positive emotions are better.
So,
But
sorry,
I'm not sure that's true.
clarify really quickly. My question is actually less about how the benefits of mixed emotions are perceived within people doing their research, and more about how Lee theories out in the world, people not involved in the science, conceptualize the value of experiencing positive versus mixed emotions, and their perceptions of the value of feeling good and not bad as a potential challenge to communicate.
So I guess I was answering for that question too. I don't think it's like that out there in the world, that people necessarily have that particular bias. We do.
Yeah, there's really great work by Maya Tamir showing that people are motivated to put themselves into negative emotional states if they believe that it'll be instrumental to achieve their goals in a situation. And so and most of the measures are, she doesn't actually often, though in some studies she has had people get themselves in that mood, but usually she's asking them, do you think it would be valuable? So she's actually answering that exact question. And so I think for mixed emotional states, I think the implication is that if there are situations in which people perceive that they'll best achieve their goals, whatever they are, by some sort of mix of emotional experiences, then that they would be motivated to put themselves into them if they can and if they exist.
And you've just got to look at whatever they are. I'm not sure what they call normal everyday sayings. Hard work pays off. If you work really hard, if you put a lot of effort in, you'll achieve something, right? That's. Parents say that to their children, athletes.
Yeah, let me just add another angle to this, in particular why, for example, the work that I represent today, why negative emotions or the avoidance of negative emotions seems to appear so much. It's not only about the individual, but living in the community. And if you take a look at formal institutions for social control, they focus on the negative and making sure people don't do that. And so there is an accent in our work that informally people are also paying attention to what's happening to them negatively, so they don't do that. And the net effect of that is not only, let's say, a benefit for the individual, but also a benefit for the society they live in. They don't, quote unquote, commit a crime, if you will, even though it's informal, that they otherwise might have committed. So it's an interesting question about the presence of negative emotions and what exact functions they might be serving.
Mm-hmm.
My question was actually very related to that, and that's fantastic in the world of positive psychology where there's apps to the 90-day challenge to only experience positive emotions. I hope my grad students don't do that because they won't be productive in those 90 days. But it's interesting when we look at these mixed emotions because in some situations it's infusing positive in a negative situation, and that's clearly emotion regulatory goals, or at least that's what I'm assuming. And then there's these other situations where people are infusing negative into what could be a positive situation, and these are very different mixed emotional experiences. And so what I want to ask everyone, because I think you all would have interesting things to say, are situations, and exactly what you were just talking about. And I understand that, work hard and pay off, but also what really struck me was like the television viewing was one of the most mixed emotional experiences. You could tell it's not what you want to watch on TV. And I was thinking, well, there's also, if you're interested in politics, you want to watch that, you will experience a negative emotion, I'm assuming these days. But I was interested in your ideas about maintaining life satisfaction or enriching that in late life, or opting for information both in Jacky and Derek's work, or people who decide to engage in risky decisions that are tension-filled. What is the motivator there in just watching TV in your house, or what is the motivator there to infuse those negative emotions in life?
Mm-hmm.
As we talked about a little bit before, I think people are curious. Negative information has high novelty value sometimes, and I think that is, that's just how it is. I mean, people are curious, and so I think we probably are going to see more effects of individual differences beyond, sort of past the initial curiosity, once people have satisfied their initial curiosity. And I think that it speaks to the fact that novelty or curiosity could be, maybe a stronger influence on initial preferences than hedonics or other sorts of goals. And so I guess it speaks to the sort of the specific, we've sort of talked about context, but the context changes as a function of where in the information process you're processing. And so I think that, you could make the argument that people sometimes would engage with negative material on TV because they want to make themselves angry in this sort of in the myotomy sense. So that's probably one additional motivation that's sort of superimposed on the curiosity. But it's true that there's a lot of really interesting negative content that's out there, and I think it's interesting given sort of current conceptual models and thinking that people who say that they're extremely happy nonetheless will subject themselves to negative material in those situations.
Yeah, so I mean, the television is an interesting thing. We don't know what people are actually watching, right? But and people are watching for many different hours, and some people say it's on 24 hours a day. It's just wallpaper, basically, But their attention is slipping in and out, and they may be doing many other activities at the same time. And so we don't know what their so-called secondary activities are. And that's the same in the American Time Use study too. So we get similar hours reported by age groups, but they ask, are you doing something else at the same time? They might be exercising, they might be cooking dinner or whatever, right? And I think so. The issue is that in Derek's context, right? We're assuming that their attention is captured, and so they're processing what's going on. We don't know if people's attention is captured while you're watching TV. It probably flickers in and out. It might be the end of the football. And these were only weekday activities that I showed you. So.
I don't think we studied very much in terms of the issue of emotional transitions either.
Yeah.
And we talked a lot about mixed emotions here in somewhat state sorts of ways, even though we've all said we don't believe in state and stuff, but that's what we've done. But emotional transitions are really interesting periods that people sometimes will put themselves in a place to watch Rudy. I love Rudy, because Rudy is really all about transitions. I mean, that whole movie is about being sad and then feeling triumphant and good and so on. I mean, we choose, content to engage that oftentimes will make us feel really emotionally bad. Maybe because the transition from feeling bad to a transition to feeling good is really what it's about. It's not feeling good or feeling bad. It's really about the transition. And so we may need to start looking at, how the transition points happen, between emotional states or processes. Just to make that point, your point brings up.
And what time scale is that, those transitions?
She will. Go ahead. Oh, no, I think, well, I don't know who's controlling that.
Okay.
We can finish this point.
I was just asking how fast did the transitions happen? Is it every 19 seconds? Does it have to go on Facebook, Google, Word, or is it
See, only researchers and a methodologist would raise that particular question.
Yeah,
So you
especially
raise this particular issue
timers and
about thinking
time
about a
scales.
different way of doing it, and the methodologist says to you, how long is that last? No way. I don't know, it's a very interesting question.
Neil, if you want to study it, there have been two major changes in product use in the past 25 years. The first is they end, they don't fade out anymore. The second is that songs are much more likely to be written in minor key as opposed to a major key. I would go and study that to look at the time frame of transitions.
Is that the key of life? What is it?
I don't know what the key of life is, but it's much more likely to be
It's
minor
Stevie
key.
Wonder, good grief.
Yeah.
So, but, sorry, so that, I mean, there is some interesting work in the, in the field of work, right? So, and we find this also in the HRS. So, work is, I think, a very interesting thing. So it's associated with stress. People say, oh, it's stress, you know, work, stress, but they're also happy. So how do you explain that? Right? And so there's some people, of course, who would say stressed, tired, or whatever, you know, irritated, frustrated, only. But we tried to model that, at least in the robust, and we saw some subgroups of people, and we heard them, we listened to their tapes on the telephone. So they said they were super stressed at work, and they came home, and it was total relaxation. Right? And then they did the same thing again, over and over. So is that bad for your health? I mean, that's the question, right? There are other people who said they were super stressed at work, then they came home, they ate, and then they got onto a computer game, and they were stressed out because they were not winning. So they were exacerbating this level of stress that most, like those sort of people, may well not be doing something good for their health, because we try to look at health outcomes. So we don't know. I mean, that sort of work, I think, is very interesting.
So, Jacky, I love your data and connecting the mixed emotions to the different activities. And so my macro question for everybody is around the relation between one's environmental complexity and one's ability to experience mixed emotions. So we saw a little bit of that, I think, with Milan's graph yesterday for countries, right? Oh, look, Denmark and Finland. People are pretty much happy and have good well-being, and they don't have as much mixed emotion. And then in Bulgaria, people have mixed emotion and they're not happy. I could think that there was some differences in the kinds of day-to-day experiences that people in those countries might have, right? So that's my macro question. But the previous discussion, I need to veer off a little bit. So television, and motives and why do people watch. So in the 1950s, as a response to this idea that media had these hypodermic effects, and that media was influencing people, there was a whole growth in the uses and gratifications perspective, led mostly by women, talking about why do people choose what they choose, right? So if you take engagement with media as perhaps motivated by feeling emotion, then there's a variety of reasons why people do that. And they've mapped out in uses and gratifications all of these sorts of things that people are talking about. It's on in the background, it's there for friendship, it's there to regulate emotion. Dolph Zillman talked about, is it hedonic, right? Are you always trying to improve your mood? Later work has shown that that's not actually true. And that in fact there's a lot of use of utility. 20 years ago, Marissa Cantor, Joni Cantors, who some of you probably know, looked at older adults and whether they would choose to see positive or negative depictions of being elderly. And what they basically found was that people were regulating their feelings, but not directly by choosing positive content. They were choosing the content that gave their current situation the best light. So it was a social comparison kind of account. So before I joined the communication science department, I was trained as a social psychologist. I had no idea this literature existed, because there's psych info, and there's communication and mass media complete, and the two do not overlap. So if folks are really interested in what motivates older people, younger people to choose
What?
There's a really great literature out there where people have tried to prove this. But back to complexity of experience.
Okay, so I think that's a wonderful question, and I hope that you jump in and utilize the wealth of information in HRS to determine that. So you could certainly look at many different aspects of environmental complexity. So whether people live in a highly densely populated area, the outer suburban area, which region of the US, is it polluted, is it not polluted, are they surrounded by a bit large extended family, have they moved recently to be near their family? I mean, you just have to be creative, think of a variable and you could probably find it. Right. But please do it.
I guess I just want to say, in terms of your other point, I mean, we're certainly aware of the communication literature that is relevant to these questions as well. And I think that there's still, and you as trained in social psychology can appreciate this, that our goal in this work had been to study choice, particularly with experimental paradigms that are familiar to emotion regulation researchers and have that level of control over the stimuli, which of course you can't do when you're looking at people's actual behavior in their home. There are trade-offs to that, but for the kinds of questions that we wanted to ask and hypotheses we wanted to test, we needed that level of control. So, for me to be convinced of whether somebody's using a choice as an emotion regulation strategy, I may not be convinced by them telling me that they're doing that. I would want to see some evidence in a way that's, again, parallel to emotion regulation research, and we can certainly debate whether there's how much value there is in trusting one over the other. So anyway, I just want to respond to that point.
So I'm trained in epidemiology, and so when you were talking, this whole panel was talking about sort of changes over life, what James talked about, change in life satisfaction, or you're talking about sort of middle age sort of things. I was thinking about suicide. And suicide risk in the U.S. is highest among older adults. It's true in most countries, with the exception of some countries in Southeast Asia. And in the U.S. until about 5 or 6 years ago, it was true that it was highest among older adults, but now with middle age, people in their 40s and 50s have higher risk of suicide than their prior cohorts. And that, I was trying to think about how that might map onto some of the things that we're talking about today. And one of the main risk factors for suicide is hopelessness. And so I've been thinking during this panel about the role of hope as a potential word that encapsulates mixed emotions, because it sort of implies that things are not good now, but in some time in the future they may be better. And I guess I just wanted the panel to respond to that.
Well, it's a tough one.
Go, Jane.
Well, hopelessness does not imply somehow that there's not much that's possible now, and there's not going to be anything possible in the future. I'm trying to get some sense about how you were thinking about that.
Just that, we talk about hopelessness being a risk factor for depression, but is hope in and of itself a mixed emotion, I guess is my sort of, and that is, can we think about how something like hope, I don't know that hopelessness is actually the flip of hope, maybe it is, but that if we can think about the ways that, again, it also came from this idea of suicide risk, like this idea of like this is a hopeless state, this is why people are willing to end their lives. But to think about how something like an idea of hope might even develop. I don't know that children, for example, experience hope. When do people experience this emotion, and is it in and of itself something that the meaning of which changes over the life course?
Has anybody done work on hope on the panel?
On hope?
Yeah.
I just know there's a scale, Schneider or something. So there are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there are groups that are looking at hope. I think it's a very interesting idea because it's like you're hoping that things get better, right? So it's an implication that something isn't right. Hope for the silver lining or whatever it is, right? I guess the closest that you could get at HRS is we might have an item on hope.
It's in the CESD, there's an item on do you feel hopeful in this essay.
Right. but we have optimism that's sort of,
But I mean, is hope a mixed emotion?
I was thinking this
Yeah.
morning about anxiety as a mixed emotion. I mean,
Yeah.
if I'm currently in a mostly, things are positive, but I feel anxious, which never happens. That is in some sense a mixed state. I mean, so things are fine now, but I can imbue that with some anxiety about the future.
yeah.
Yeah,
That's what Jeff wants to
There may be some people in the audience too, so.
Yeah, well, yeah, you have to be careful about the definition of hope. Because hope actually carries two different meanings. One is optimism. The second is, despite optimism, I'm still going to act. And if you take it into the dictionary, and in terms of what people say, they act in both terms of the word hope. And the reason I asked anybody to study hope here, only informally in the sense that I presented data today, that people are willing to take risks on other people they're not willing to take on coin. And if you ask them what led them to do that, hope comes up as a word very, very frequently. So hope not only is something that binds us to hopefully a better future, it binds us to each other. If you take a look at how much we operate on hope in our interactions with other people.
It's one of the reasons why under DSM-5, as you well know, there is an attempt to break the link between depression and suicide, because that link is no longer thought to be what it was. And you already know that if you take a look at what the distribution is of who commits suicide. In some ways, sometimes the people who actually have the most hope, or who have attained more, are actually the people who are committing suicide, and the other people who are not. So it's a complicated, sort of issue in terms of whatever that particular emotion is and what it's all about. But I think some other people may have some thoughts about hope.
So I was reminded of something that was said yesterday, that maybe mixed emotions are like the remnants of appraisals from situations long since past. I found that really interesting. So when Jacky mentioned a preoccupied mind is a mixed emotion experiencer, I was wondering if there's ways to move around these measures of activity-based and daily reconstruction measures to sort of map, and I don't know the time scale on this, the map the
It's
night
19 seconds.
I don't know, appraisal rates from previous situations to new situations.
Right. Yeah. Someone will be clever doing it, right? So it's like, it's a learning phase in a way, right? If it's a remnant, then it's a sort of learning, some aspect of learning, or long-term memory, something like that, right? That's going on. Yeah, but Bill, you can do that. It's project review. I think it's a very interesting, I think all of these things are very interesting processes to think about, and we just don't, maybe we're opening up many more questions, and that's perhaps what's meant to be, right? We're opening up many more questions, new ways of thinking about data, revisiting ambivalence models and measurement models, and figuring out, what goes where. But maybe we could, I think, in general, people, it's a sort of movement against only thinking about positive effect and negative effect, balance between the two, which, I don't know, right? So
Maybe we could continue this intriguing conversation over lunch, since we're hitting about that time and lunch is ready for us. And we're going to start up again at 1:30. Lunch is being provided. So can you thank the panel?